Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. Did inflation really just hit 0%?
Today we learned that last month our economy had 0% inflation. In July, we saw a drop in gas prices and a range of other goods like clothing and airfares and household appliances, which means more money in the pockets of working families. Last month, our economy had 0% inflation.
Well, that might not be the full story. You see, it really depends on how you present the data. I think we can all agree that we are still feeling the effects of inflation. A lot of Americans are pushing themselves further into debt as they feel the constraints of higher prices. So making the statement and presenting it that inflation is now 0% makes it seem like, poof, inflation's gone, way to go team! While I don't want to make the situation seem worse than it is, we don't want to put on rosy glasses and make it seem better than it is either. It's probably best to just see the situation for what it truly is. And for that, we have to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the data to get the full picture. In June, inflation hit 40-year highs, coming in at 9.1%. In July, the rate of inflation did ease up and came in at 8.5%. And this is fantastic news for the economy, especially when you consider that they were expecting inflation to come in at 8.7% for July. Beating expectations is always a good thing. So maybe this means we hit the peak of inflation and now we're on the road to recovery. Maybe this means that what the Fed is doing, the tightening of monetary supply and increasing interest rates, is working. Maybe it is forcing people to spend less money. We're also starting to see some of those kinks in the supply chain get worked out. For the past 2.5 years, it's been shortages and delays in practically every industry as the pandemic brought pretty much everything to a screeching halt. But post-pandemic, or rather mid-pandemic, consumer demand shot up for practically all consumer goods. So this led to supply chain issues. And it's not to say that these supply chain issues are gone, but we are seeing improvements, and that is a good thing. But back to the numbers. How can one report say 0% inflation and another say 8.5% inflation? Because those are drastically different numbers. Well, for that, we have to refer to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. For a quick breakdown, the CPI measures a basket of goods and services and averages out their price change over time. So what goes into this average? Well, it's the typical things that consumers spend money on: food, transport, housing, etc. But these categories aren't given equal weight. It looks more like this. And these averages are calculated from price checks on more than 94,000 goods and services. And these prices are checked every single month. Well, except for housing, because housing costs, rental prices, those don't change as frequently, so those are checked every 6 months. But being that these prices are checked so frequently, it gives us a lot of data points to go off of, and that's where we can get the difference between an 8.5% number and a 0% number. From June of 2022 to July of 2022, CPI stayed relatively flat. Some categories increased, some categories decreased, but when you average it out, there wasn't really all that much of a change. So being that CPI stayed relatively flat from one month to the next, you can say that inflation hit 0%. And CPI staying flat or not rising is wonderful news, because at this point we have had 25 consecutive months of nonstop rising costs. So to have a month where costs are not increasing on average is great news for the economy. But again, that doesn't paint a full picture. What about that 8.5% figure? Well, from July of 2021 to July of 2022, the CPI shows that that basket of goods and services on average went up 8.5%. So inflation is still going strong, but it is easing, and easing inflation is great news. I just think it's a more accurate statement to say that inflation is easing rather than saying inflation is at 0%. On average, the prices of goods and services from June of this year to July of this year stayed the same. But we all know averages don't tell the whole story. The categories that saw declines in prices were predominantly gas, fuel oil, airfare, and vehicles. The market for used vehicles is returning to normal after more than a year of inflated prices due to high consumer demand and short supply. The new vehicle market, however, is being driven by ongoing inventory shortages, so the dynamics are difficult. Supply remains very tight and on an absolute basis remains even lower than it was last year. Vehicle prices are elevated and incentives are at historic lows because, for the most part, demand continues to outstrip supply. And with limited capacity to produce vehicles, automakers are clearly focused on building more expensive models and configurations to maximize revenue and profits per sale. Industry experts expect the price of new vehicles to remain elevated at least through the end of the year. So if you don't need to buy a vehicle, maybe it's best to hold off until that calendar flips to 2023. As far as those CPI categories that still saw price increases, those were natural gas, electricity, housing, and notably food. Of course, every category matters because practically all of us are spending in each category in one way or another. But I know a lot of us tend to keep our eyes on those day-to-day items, namely food and gas. And while we have seen the price of fuel come down recently, which is a lot of relief for a lot of people, food prices are still on the rise. In fact, from June to July, food prices increased at the fastest rate they have in over 43 years. It's kind of a mixed blessing for individual households. They probably like what they see on the gasoline prices coming down, but they're still seeing the pain on the food side. In the past year alone, grocery prices have increased on average 13%, and disproportionately, the increase in price of essential goods affects those with lower incomes at a greater level because they are spending a greater percentage of their income on these essentials. On average, households with incomes of up to $86,000 a year report spending 80% of their income on just the essentials, meaning they don't have all that much wiggle room in their budget. On the surface, it may look like 20% of their income is left for fun money, in this case about $17,000, but remember, those are pre-tax dollars, and once you factor in taxes and spread that dollar amount over an entire year, it's easy to see why inflation hurts so much. July is notoriously a month for discounting for many retailers as we naturally start to see consumer demand wane towards the end of the summer months. Many consumers at this point have wrapped up their summer travel plans and are starting to head back to work and school full time. So part of this easing of demand really could just be part of our natural economic cycles, but many of these numbers do point to an improving situation. Improving supply chains, falling commodity prices, and bloated inventories at retailers who overordered after experiencing extremely high demand last year have provided hope that a long, elusive, disinflationary impulse from core goods and prices might finally arrive. We do, however, continue to expect the strong dollar and easing supply chain constraints to weigh on import prices later this year, and in turn on consumer good prices by the first half of 2023. So perhaps relief is in sight. We've had a lot of good news in the past couple weeks. The stock market has taken a turn, the NASDAQ entered bull territory, inflation may have seen its peak, and the job market remains strong. All of these signs point to an economy that is pivoting towards sunnier days, but it's important to remember that we're not out of the woods just yet. Keep in mind that our narrative was very different just 2 months ago. The Fed still has a lot of work to do to get inflation down to that target rate of 2%. And while inflation may finally be easing, maybe we hit the peak and we're on the stride down, many consumers are still feeling the burden of higher costs. So perhaps trying to sweep inflation under the rug and saying it doesn't exist and that it's at 0% is a bit of a slap in the face for many, because inflation is still there. It is still real. What are your guys' thoughts on inflation? Leave them in the comments down below. I read every single one and I try to reply as many as possible. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you soon. Bye. Well, that might be, it really does. Shortage chains, this left twos, and while inflation target 2% rate, oh my god, 2021 to themselves out. Industry experts, new vehicles, for many retailers, these signs, the pandemic, I don't want to make the point, we have I don't want to make this